It's my pleasure to introduce Dan Schnur, a politics professor at USC, UC, and Pepperdine, who will be speaking today on how the coronavirus is changing our politics.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this very experimental webcast. For those of you who have been able to attend some of our programs in the past, it's good to be able to work with you again in some type of setting. And for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet in person, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as well. If we haven't had a chance to do a program together in the past, the first thing I'll do is start out by telling you that just as in my classrooms at FC and at Berkeley and at Pepperdine, I think it's really important for the role I play here to be one not of advocate, but rather one of analyst. And anyone who signs on to an LA World Affairs Council Town Hall program is already a pretty intelligent person. They don't need me who to vote for or to tell them which party or what particular cause to support. So what we're going to try to do over the course of this hour and in our subsequent sessions is not to take sides on behalf of one party, one candidate, one elected official or the other. What I'll do is I'll do my best to offer you some analysis and oversight of how the coronavirus is changing and may change our politics going forward, particularly as it relates to the 2020 presidential campaign, but also beyond. And then as Kim said, after I offer some opening thoughts, then by all means, we'd really like to turn this into a conversation. And Jessica will field your questions, pass them on to me, and hopefully at the end of the hour, we'll have had an opportunity to have at least a somewhat enlightening conversation about what this very new and very different and unprecedented political landscape looks like. So I'm going to talk about three basic topics today before we open it up. Number one, I'd like to talk about what sort of elections we're going to have this year. Number two, about what sort of campaign we'll have this year on this new landscape. And number three, how will the virus and how has the virus impacted the campaign and the candidates and how they conduct themselves. And then once we open it up, there's, in addition to those topics, if there's other things you'd like to talk about, we certainly can, whether broader topics or more specific news of the day. The Senate passed its relief package by unanimous vote yesterday. The House will take that vote up tomorrow. There's an ongoing and increasing debate over when and how economic activity can resume in this country. And third, there's a number of other government and policy priorities that are likely to fall by the wayside in the weeks and months ahead. Governor Newsom here in California made it clear earlier this week that unless the issue was related to the coronavirus, to our housing challenges, and it's the state's ongoing wildfire emergencies, that legislation probably wasn't going to get much of a hearing this year, which includes a lot of other topics that would be of real urgency under other circumstances. We can even talk about who Joe Biden is going to pick as a running mate. So any of the topics that you guys want to get to, we can in just a little bit. But let me start out with those three topics, starting with what sort of elections will we have this year? Because there's been a lot of conversation going on and a lot of speculation going on about how we can conduct elections during a period of social distancing. So first of all, there's been a lot of speculation about the potential for the general election being canceled. And what I can tell you is any number of constitutional scholars across the ideological spectrum agree that because that election is constitutionally required, it simply cannot be canceled. Now, the election can be delayed by a vote of Congress, but it cannot be canceled. And whether the election has taken place or not, according to the Constitution, on January 21st, 2021, a new president is going to take office. And if an election has not been held, according to constitutional scholars, by January of next year, the act of presidential succession will kick in. And because neither Donald Trump or Mike Pence will have been reelected, the presidential succession will kick in. And depending on who you listen to, that means that either the third person in succession, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, will then become acting president. Or some scholars argue that, of course, Pelosi, as a member of the House of Representatives, would not be eligible either if an election was not held. So if no election is held, for you, those of you who are interested in this type of detail, Senator Patrick Leahy, the Democratic senator from Vermont, the senior member of that body, would then become the acting president of the United States. So I know that some of our regular participants are somewhat virulent in their opposition and concerns about the current president. If you harbor concerns that the current administration might attempt to cancel or unduly delay the election, know that Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont would become acting president in all likelihood under that scenario. More likely is that the election will take place, but it's going to take place under dramatically different circumstances than we've ever had in the past. As part of the recovery package that the Senate passed yesterday, roughly $400 million was set aside to help the states adjust to this new reality. And there's some debate about whether that's a sufficient amount of money or not. We'll hear more about that in the weeks ahead. I suspect a lot more will have to be allocated. But the thought would be to move all states to the circumstances that we currently have here in California, in which there's what's called no excuse mail voting. For those of you who live in California, the odds are more likely than not that you now vote for mail, whether you need to or not. In 1990, when I first came to California, between 15 and 20% of Californians voted absentee. In 2018, more than 2/3 of the state's voters voted by mail. And while there are 6 states in the country that have all mail elections now, I suspect the movement in Congress would be to do no excuse mail voting around the country, and also to spread out in-person voting in the days or perhaps even weeks before the election, an increased emphasis on early voting. So it's going to take a lot of money and it's going to take a lot of adjustment. But although California's elections certainly have not been seamless, for those of you who live in LA County and may have waited in line for a while earlier this month, you know that there's still work to be done. Is generally agreed upon that California's no excuse mail voting is a model that's likely to be duplicated around the country as we move forward. Even more immediately than that, of course, is the question of the primaries. Since March 12th, when 3 states, Arizona, Florida, and Illinois, held their presidential primaries, the state of Ohio postponed its primary. All the other states that have been scheduled to have primaries over the months of March and most of April have postponed their primaries as well. Right now, the next primary scheduled to take place is on Saturday, April 4th, in the states of Alaska and Hawaii, and a caucus in the state of Wyoming. And all 3 of those elections will take place completely by mail. The only more traditional primary that's currently scheduled over the next month is in my home state of Wisconsin on Tuesday, April 7th, where, like in California, they have no excuse mail voting as well. And there's currently debate going on in their political circles about what steps to take to expand it. The rest of the primaries for most of April have all been delayed till May and June. Right now, Tuesday, April 28th, which was supposed to be a mid-Atlantic primary with New York, Pennsylvania, and several other states voting, with the exception of New York, which is almost certainly to delay its primary under the current crisis they're facing there. Pennsylvania and all of the other Atlantic states that had primaries scheduled for April 28th have moved theirs back as well. So the primary season almost certainly will resume, but it will resume on a much more belated basis. And the practical impact of that is primarily on Joe Biden, because after Biden's victories in South Carolina and on Super Tuesday and on March 12th, it's pretty clear that he was on a glide path to the nomination, and his plan and expectations were that he would spend each of the next several Tuesdays compiling more delegates, continuing to build momentum and attention toward a general election campaign against the president. And what the delays of this primary have done is, of course, it slowed that process. And we'll talk more in a few minutes about the challenges that Biden is facing as a non-office holder at this critical point in his campaign. But at least for now, suffice it to say that the fact that these primaries are being moved back from March or April later into the spring and possibly summer is going to delay Biden's nomination, deprive him of the platform that he would have under more normal circumstances, and has also encouraged Bernie Sanders to stay in the campaign longer than he might have in a more normal situation. So there's the second point I want to bring up, in addition to what sort of elections we'll have, is what sort of campaign will we have? How will the coronavirus change the way politics is practiced? And these are the kind of things that we can talk about in more detail in just a few minutes if you decide it's of interest to you, but I'll just raise a few points to consider. No in-person campaigning. For the first time, not just in American history, but arguably in human history. No face-to-face, person-to-person campaigning between candidates and voters. For Donald Trump and for Bernie Sanders, that means none of the massive rallies that have fueled their respective candidacies currently and in the past. And for Joe Biden, whose greatest strength is person-to-person, hand-to-hand, what's often called tactile campaigning, is something that's obviously not available to him either. And so what that means is that not just Trump and Biden and Sanders, but candidates at every level of the ballot this year are going to become more reliant than ever on digital outreach. Traditional television advertising, traditional direct mail becoming increasingly important as well. There's already evidence that the audiences for not just cable news, but for the network evening news programs have dramatically increased. I read this morning in the Los Angeles Times that the ABC and NBC evening news are now receiving their greatest audiences since the early 2000s, given that people are understandably frightened and concerned and looking for news and information about the virus. But I suspect that kind of news influence will continue to grow going forward. So what does that mean for campaigns if they rely more on TV ads and more on digital than on person-to-person campaigning and the type of news coverage that comes from those rallies and those in-person events? Well, one of the things we talk about in my class a lot is the two goals that any campaign has. Any political campaign of either party has to accomplish two things at the same time in order to win victory. Number one, that campaign has to motivate their base, their most loyal supporters. Number two, they have to persuade undecided voters. And there's a longer conversation for another day about how different campaigns balance between those two goals of base motivation and persuading undecideds. What we do know is that digital campaigning, while faster and more precise and more valuable in any number of other ways, tends to be much, much more effective in terms of base motivation. It's a lot harder to engage an undecided voter online, whether it's through email or text or through social media. And so what campaigns that rely on digital communications tend to do is spend a lot more time rallying their own base than trying to reach out to undecided voters. So if you're one of those voters like me who tends to occupy the space in between the 40-yard lines of American politics, not necessarily undecided, but willing to vote for candidates of both parties under certain circumstances, if you feel like you've been receiving less attention in recent years during political campaigns, that's probably right, because you probably are. And in an election that relies as heavily on virtual campaigning as this one is likely to, those voters at or near the center of the political spectrum are in all likelihood going to get even less attention than usual. And even more so than in 2016, this is going to become an election about whether Trump or whether Biden is more adroit at motivating their existing support base rather than growing their ranks of supporters. Last thing I'll mention, and then we'll open it up, is I want to talk on my third point about how the virus and how has the virus impacted the campaign and the candidates. And we've talked about that a little bit, but I want to go into a little bit more detail before we open this up. Given this very, very increased level of importance of digital and online campaigning, it's pretty clear that the work that Senator Sanders and his team have done both in this election and in 2016 are paying off for him. Sanders and his team are very comfortable with online campaigning, and since the virus shut down in-person political activity, the Sanders campaign has done an excellent job of using the tools of technology to keep Sanders in front of the relevant audience and voters. And even while the likelihood of him achieving the nomination is very, very slim at this point, he's been able to remain much more visible than many candidates would be under certain circumstances, just because he's comfortable and just because his campaign is proficient at using these tools to establish and further an online and social media platform for him. And unfortunately, and I say this not to take sides, as I said at the outset, I'm here to analyze, not to advocate for any candidate or any party. But I think most reasonable observers would agree that Vice President Biden and his campaign have really struggled with these new tools. After what I thought was a very forceful performance in their most recent debate, Biden since then really has had a much more difficult time having himself heard through online media and through social media. That may change. His campaign has put together a studio in the recreation room of his house, which has allowed him to become a little bit more visible over the last few days. But over the last week or two, Biden has struggled, both for technological reasons and also because simply he's not an office holder at this point. We talk a lot about the candidate's window of opportunity to communicate with voters. The more you can get them to pay attention to what you have to say, the more likely they are to support you. And one thing that Donald Trump does very effectively, both in this election and back in 2016, is he's very, very good at expanding his window of opportunity for messaging with the voters and for crowding other people out. And the challenge for Biden right now is because, unlike Donald Trump, he's not the president. Unlike Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi, he's not in Congress. Unlike Andrew Cuomo or Gavin Newsom or Mike DeWine, he's not in elected office at all. And so in addition to the technological challenges, the other challenge for Biden as someone who does not hold office is, despite the fact that he has a tremendous amount of experience, it appears that he and his team are still figuring out how to make him relevant to the conversation. I think one of the most important things to watch in the presidential campaign over the next couple of weeks is how Biden deals with that challenge. And if he can figure out a way to make himself not just more technologically proficient, but more relevant, so voters are going to be more willing to hear what he has to say. Now, it's worth offering a cautionary note on that. Things always change quickly in politics, but what we've learned is they change even more quickly under unusual circumstances like this one. 2 weeks ago, the president was being pilloried, not just by his usual opponents, but by even some allies, at how much he had struggled in his initial address to the nation 2 weeks ago Wednesday, and in his first news conference a couple days later. But more recently, in the last few days, we've seen polling information that shows that, in fact, voters are giving President Trump a favorable response in terms of how he's handling this crisis. Now, his numbers are not as strong, not nearly as strong as, for example, the nation's governors are. But one thing that we can talk about in a couple minutes is the growing level of approval that voters have for the president and the way he's handled these challenges. I guess the last point I'd make, and then by all means we'll bring in Jessica and we'll open it up to your questions, is more broadly speaking, outside of terms of crises like these, one of the truisms of American politics is that presidents always get too much credit when things are good, and they always get too much blame when things are bad. So we've known from the beginning that this election was going to be a referendum on Donald Trump, even to a greater extent than elections are usually referendums on the incumbent. Just as he dominates that messaging window of opportunity, Trump so dominates the national political conversation that this election is almost inevitably going to be an up or down vote on him. And one of the implicit arguments that Vice President Biden's supporters have made over the months to Democratic primary voters is that by nominating a more centrist candidate like Biden, that would allow the election to be a referendum on Trump rather than a more ideologically intense alternative like Sanders or Warren. So what it appears at this early stage is that if presidents always get too much credit when things are good, and they always get too much blame when things are bad, if this election was always going to be a referendum on Trump, the coronavirus just makes that more so. And over the weeks and months ahead, in much more than what Trump says or does on a daily basis, if voters begin to feel that the health crisis is passing, that plays to the president's benefit. if come fall we are still facing very severe health and medical challenges, then he'll be harmed by that, probably or possibly irreparably. And what Trump is increasingly focusing on over the last few days is, in addition to how voters feel about health and medical threats they may be facing, they're also going to be very concerned about any economic challenges that they're facing. And so when you hear the president talking about beginning to look for ways to open up the economy, that's him realizing that even if the health crisis is passed, if in October or November voters are feeling economically dislocated, that's going to harm him. And so, at least in that, through that narrow context, it's not surprising that he's already beginning to look for ways to move the economy forward, even though in the face of many medical experts, it might be somewhat premature. Anyway, so we're about 20 minutes in. Hopefully I've offered a few thoughts that you'd like to talk further about. But if you send your question in, Jessica will raise them, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. Feel free to ask about any of those three broader topics that we talked about, or anything else going on in politics now, and I'll do my best to answer over the time that we've got left.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We're getting a lot of questions in. So the first question I have is, what happens if the conventions get canceled? Will the process be able to be completed remotely? And what specific issues would require the need to cancel the November election?
Okay. Well, I'll take the second one first. There simply is no circumstance, at least constitutionally, in which the election would be canceled in November. And as I said earlier, a delay would be possible, but only by a vote of Congress, which would require bipartisan support. But even under even much more difficult circumstances than we're currently facing, it seems pretty likely that an election would take place, even if only by mail. And if it didn't, like I said, for whatever the reason, the provision is, given the terms of succession, that either a Democratic House Speaker or a Democratic President of the U.S. Senate would become acting president. I think to a large degree, eliminating the likelihood that this administration would attempt to do anything to delay the election unduly or to cancel it. As far as the conventions, the Democratic National Convention, which comes first, given that they're the party that doesn't hold the White House, have only in the last few days begun to let it be known that they are potentially considering other alternatives to an in-person gathering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin this summer. For any number of reasons, they've been holding firm that the convention is going to take place as planned. My own opinion is that's very, very unlikely, and it would require them to make major changes in their own internal rules to let the delegates vote, not just for the nominee, but for the platform, for rules, and other considerations online. And it's speculated that one of the reasons that Senator Sanders is staying in the race, even though he knows it's very unlikely that he becomes the nominee, is that he believes, or his supporters believe, that if the party platform were to be decided virtually, electronically, by Zoom or by webinar, that his supporters, the longer he stays in and the more delegate support he attracts, the better positioned he would be to impact the overall platform. So the Democratic National Committee has only begun to talk about possibly thinking about other alternatives. I think it's more than likely that they'll end up moving this direction. The Republican Party's convention comes a month later, says that they have no plans for redoing the way the convention is held. I predict that that's going to change in the next few weeks also. So unlike a federal election, general election, which is mandated by the Constitution, party conventions are governed by those party rules. And while it's difficult to change them, I think particularly if we're still in a social distancing phase come this summer, virtual national conventions is, if not a likelihood, a very strong probability.
Thank you. Can you please provide more detail regarding why Nancy Pelosi, as a third in order for succession, could not become the president if a presidential election is not held? And if Leahy became president, could it be challenged in court?
Well, there's a range of opinions among constitutional scholars about how the succession would take place. Where there is widespread agreement is that if no election is held, then neither the president nor the vice president can hold office as of January 21st, 2021. The point of disagreement among constitutional scholars is whether the Speaker of the House would be able to then take her place in that succession. On one hand, the Speaker, as most of you know, I'm sure all of you know, is the third in line of succession to the presidency. But the counter argument is that if there wasn't an election for president, there almost certainly wouldn't have been an election for the House of Representatives, which means just like Trump and Pence would technically not be able to be president or vice president of the United States, that Pelosi would no longer be Speaker of the House of Representatives. And it is a subject of intense debate and would almost certainly be settled in the courts. Quick thing on Leahy is currently Senator Leahy is only the second most senior member of the US Senate. And traditionally, the president pro tem is, actually, I should back up for a second. Traditionally, the president pro tem of the Senate is not the most senior member overall, but the senior member of the majority party. So currently, the president pro tem of the United States Senate is Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. But the supposition goes, if elections for president and for the House of Representatives aren't held, then presumably elections for the Senate would not be held either. And because the Republicans have so many more seats up this November than Democrats do, that if all 33 of the seats that would be voted on this November aren't voted on, the remaining Senate would then have a Democratic majority, which would allow Leahy to become president pro tem and therefore become president. So this is pretty complicated and pretty very arcane stuff, and I apologize for that. But the questioner's last point is the most important one. It almost certainly ends up in court. But the part where there is widespread agreement is, while there is disagreement about whether a speaker or a president pro tem becomes president, there's widespread agreement that a president and vice president would not be eligible to retain their offices if an election was not held.
Great. This one is from Jerry Swirling. I think he might know you. He says, what do you think is the underlying reason for the president's refusal to take dramatic action to turbocharge the supply chain of much needed medical supplies? Does he think it would cost him political support from the business community? Is it simply the classic conservative view of the limited role of the federal government?
Well, first of all, for those of you who don't know them, Jerry is one of the giants in American public relations and academia. He was my mentor when I first started at USC, and he's someone I think of often and very fondly. So Jerry, it's great to hear from you. His question, not surprisingly, is a very smart one, and that is, why has the president not employed the constitutional tools at his disposal to, in effect, nationalize major sections of American industry and manufacturing in order to deploy those resources toward the manufacture of ventilators, of masks, of other health equipment, the same way that Roosevelt used our nation's manufacturing capacity to produce planes and tanks and other pieces of military hardware during World War II. And Jerry, I think your question touches on probably the two major reasons for that. One is the president is almost certainly facing political pressure. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce believes and has said publicly that they believe that their members can be counted on to voluntarily make the switch from their normal products to the type of health and medical equipment that's so desperately needed. And companies like companies like Apple, companies like Tesla, the big three auto manufacturers are already doing so. So the argument going back and forth, not just in terms of real world politics, but in terms of political philosophy, is no one argues that we shouldn't deploy the nation's manufacturing capacity to meet this emergency. The question is whether it should be done on a mandatory basis or whether it should be done on a voluntary basis. Once again, I gave up on predictions, as some of you know, I gave up on political predictions forever back in November of 2016. But just like I feel comfortable predicting that the Democratic and National Party conventions, our parties are going to reconsider their convention schedules, I suspect as time passes, Trump will end up reconsidering his current position here. The political pressures are considerable, but the real world need is simply too strong for this to be a sustainable position for him.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. Should Biden form a shadow cabinet and start acting like he's already president?
Wow, that's a great question, and I think it raises more broadly the point that I was referring to a little bit earlier. Vice President Biden, like Vice President Pence, to be fair on a partisan basis, both men have extensive experience in government. And it's been pretty clear over the last few weeks that both of them, regardless of your own partisan leanings, have been able to address this crisis in a way that less experienced politicians in both parties have struggled to do so. The challenge, as I said a moment ago, is Biden's not in office. And the really difficult line for him to walk is between reminding people that he believes there's a much preferable alternative for dealing with this crisis, without seeming like he's being disloyal to the president during a time of national crisis. I suspect that at some point, Biden may not name an entire cabinet, but is probably going to begin talking about the types of people he would have advising him. And for example, one thing his campaign has already done is they put together a webcast of Ron Klain, who had been Biden's chief of staff in the vice president's office, and who had been tasked by President Obama to oversee the federal government's reaction to the Ebola virus back during the previous administration. And having Klain do a webinar on how the Obama administration handled that health crisis at that time. I think the questioner's point is a smart one. And like I said, even if Biden doesn't name a whole cabinet, you're probably going to hear him, in addition to talking about what he would do substantively different from Trump, talk about the people who he would look to and listen to. And as the campaign begins to leak out the names of potential vice presidential running mates, that's not only a clever way of keeping in the news cycle, but it's also a way of demonstrating that he wants to surround himself with people of a certain quality and level of experience.
Thank you so much. Do you think that we're going to see traditional red and blue state behavior with this upcoming election?
Boy, I have no idea. I just violated the pundit's first rule of punditry, because we're supposed to have answers to everything I've been told, but I don't think there's any way to know. What's one of the most interesting things about this crisis, not in a political context, but the real world health emergency, is that of course it's not hitting the entire country the same way. And that major urban areas like New York, like New Orleans, like other large cities are taking a disproportionate share of the impact. And so if you were to assume that that trending continues, that major crowded urban areas take a much bigger hit than more spread out exurban and rural communities, then you could almost assume from a political standpoint that existing red states, red counties, red voting areas become even more likely to vote red, and that those urban communities that voted heavily Democratic in recent years do so in even more significant numbers in greater percentages. But I think at this point, so early, in this crisis, I wouldn't feel comfortable making a prediction about how this impacts voting behavior on that kind of scale. So I'll sheepishly defer, and then I'll give you a very confident prediction right around Thanksgiving.
That sounds great. This question is from Consul General of Israel, Hillel Newman. He says, thanks for the webinar. There are some who claim that the American public tends to support the administration in times of crisis. Others claim that, as you mentioned, people tend to blame the administration when things are bad. Which of the two is true?
Well, not surprisingly, a really smart question from a really smart man. For those of you who haven't gotten a chance to know, our new Israeli Consul General here in LA, when circumstances allow again, it's something I'd certainly encourage. He's really an impressive man, and we're lucky to have him here. Hillel, it's a great question. Generally speaking, in wartime, in times of crisis, in wartime is probably the best parallel that we can look to, given the unprecedented nature of this challenge. In wartime, one of the things that tends to happen in politics is what's called the rally round the flag effect, which is we stand by our leaders during that time of adversity. But as Hillel's question correctly notes, that rallying effect doesn't last forever. And in fact, it just dissipates fairly quickly. There's an old saying in politics. They say that a president is never as popular again as he was on the first day of any war. A president is never popular again as he was on the first day of a war, because people originally rally to the flag. But as times get tougher and more challenging, to some degree that support dissipates. Franklin Roosevelt is a unique exception to that rule. And someday, maybe in a follow-up session when we have more time, we can examine how Roosevelt was able to maintain support over such long periods of time, even when facing tremendous adversity. But many other American presidents, and Lyndon Johnson and George W. Bush are the first two that come to mind, would tell you that that original rallying effect does dissipate as time passes. And I think it's one of the reasons that Trump is already beginning to think and talk about restarting the economy, because he recognizes that even while people are willing to persevere right now, his hunch is, and it may be a correct one, that that's not going to last if they face sustained economic dislocation.
Thank you. And this one might be a good opportunity to plug your talk next Thursday with John Thomas. This question is from David. How do you see digital campaigning as a tool for increasing turnout with new voters? Could targeted outreach in key Midwestern states and counties encourage new voters, or even provide more targeted outreach to key undecided voter populations?
It's a very smart question, David, and you're right to ask it. Changing circumstances, not just in politics, but in society, require fundamentally different approaches. And you read stories about how this country adjusted many of its habits after the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, how it adjusted its habits over the course of a depression or World War II, to some degree how we adjusted or did not adjust our habits after September 11, 2001. So it's not going to be surprising if really smart people on one or both sides of the aisle find a way to use digital political tools in a much more effective way than they have to date. I'm not dumb enough to predict which of the two parties will be better at it. What I will note is that prior to the emergence of this crisis, it was widely agreed, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats, that the Trump campaign had developed a significant digital and technological advantage over the Democrats in terms of digital outreach. And in fact, the president named his digital campaign, his digital outreach director from 2016 to be the overall campaign manager for his 2016 effort. But there will be smart people coming up with newer and better ways to use digital and social media to reach voters. And I think your question put your finger on the most important aspect of that. How do you get someone who is a less engaged voter, and undecided voters tend to be less engaged in politics than those who have strong opinions on one side or the other? How do you get a voter who tends to be relatively disengaged to pay attention to digital and social media? If I'm watching an old-fashioned TV ad at home, or an old-fashioned TV show at home, and an old-fashioned ad comes on, I have to take a proactive action to avoid that ad. I have to get up to go to the kitchen or to go to the restroom. I have to find the remote control to DVR past the ad. But if I don't do anything, I'm going to see and I'm going to receive the contents of that commercial, whether it's for an automobile or a box of cereal or for a political candidate. Online, uninvited digital intrusions, pop-up videos, tend to be much more annoying to people. And so most digital political media tends to require something proactive. You have to open an email. You have to click on a link. You have to do something. And so the challenge for that next generation of smart political digital thinkers that David's asking about is to figure out how to get not just an undecided, but a relatively disengaged voter to pay attention more than they currently would when a campaign's trying to reach out to them online. Oh, I forgot to do the plug, Jessica. I'm sorry. Next week, for those of you who aren't aware, LA World Affairs Council Town Hall has given me the great privilege of hosting a monthly breakfast series. It's called the Cal Eisenberg Breakfast Series, named after my late Uncle Cal, who among many other things reminded me of the importance of arguing politics in a spirited but in a civil way. And I think this is a particularly important reminder for all of us in these times. Next week, we're doing our regular breakfast, except that it's taking place online. And our guest is the very, very respected Republican campaign consultant, John Thomas. And John's specialty is digital media and social media applications for political campaigns. So David, I hope you and others will tune in. And for those of you who are concerned that we're going partisan, just know that for our program earlier this month in March, we had Amanda Renteria, who was the national political director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. So while John is a registered Republican, as time passes, we do try to stay as bipartisan or multi-partisan as possible. And we hope you'll join us for that conversation a week from today, 11 o'clock Pacific time. We now return you to your regularly scheduled webcast.
Thank you. This is from your fellow board member, Steve Nissen. He says, greetings and thanks, Dan. How do you think this crisis will impact the long-term political careers of state governors like our own Gavin Newsom and New York's Andrew Cuomo?
So anybody who, you've probably already figured out that anybody who attaches their name to the question is probably gonna get me to say something nice about them. And as much as I would really, really like to not say something nice about my friend Steve Nissen, I really have to, because he's a great guy too. And that's a really smart question, Steve, because one of the things that this crisis and all significant crises do is they engage voters in a much broader and deeper way than is normally the case. So for those of you in California, and I know many of you are in other parts of the country, here we are, we're a nation state of 40 million people, and the governor just doesn't really get that much attention on a daily basis under most circumstances. Even Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, at times seemed to disappear from the lives of many voters for weeks at a time, just because state government isn't particularly central to their lives. Newsom right now has a bigger platform and a larger window of opportunity than he's ever had before in his political career, and than he will ever have again. And his political career going forward, I think, will be forever defined by how he handles this crisis. And I'd say the same thing about Andrew Cuomo. It's not too long ago, a few weeks, a month ago, that there was speculation in national Democratic circles that Cuomo had made himself sort of irrelevant. There was speculation about him, like there had been about his father, that he had considered running for president. He decided not to, and for any number of reasons had been fairly incidental to the national political conversation. But the severity of this crisis, particularly in New York State and New York City, has thrust him to the forefront of the discussion in a way that has not been the case in a while. And without trying to predict the outcome for either of them or governors or mayors around the country, the overwhelming majority of them will be remembered at the end of their political careers for the way they handled these circumstances. It's a little bit too early right now to say who will be remembered fondly and who will be remembered poorly. But I would say, just quick editorial comment, not from a partisan standpoint, that I do think that governors like Cuomo and Newsom in New York and California, as well as Republican governors like Mike DeWine in Ohio, and Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, have shown themselves to be particularly strong. There's any number of others around the country, but this is going to be the most major challenge they ever take on in their careers. And so not surprisingly, it's what they're going to be remembered for.
All right, the next one Hi, Jessica and Dan. Do you think this crisis will push the Republican Party to shift its policies towards more social standings, such as Medicare, paid time off, etc., as voters potentially realize the benefit necessity of having a national baseline? Thank you, Margot.
Hey, Margot. Oh, and yes, yet another excellent question. I would say that simply by the fact that not a single Republican voted against a $2 trillion relief package in the Senate yesterday shows that the Republican Party, at least temporarily, has set aside this longtime suspicion toward big government in order to respond to the more urgent needs of an emergency. And while there are some voices in the House of Representatives that have indicated their concern about this level of spending, it looks more likely than not right now that they'll follow suit. So, Margot, I think the best way to think about your question is not whether the Republican Party will change in the face of this crisis, but rather for how long. You know, over the course of my political career, and I think you can tell by looking at my hair color and hairline, it's been a fairly long one. The Republican Party has moved from being a party that emphasized smaller government to one that began to emphasize an increased hostility to most forms of government. And what a crisis, what an emergency like this one does, is it reminds even the most impassioned conservatives that there are certain things that government has to do that no one else can. So I don't know whether this is a temporary shift or a permanent one, but I do believe that once the crisis has passed, the Republican Party that emerges will probably, at least in this respect, be a lot closer to the one that existed in the latter half of the 20th century, one that emphasized smaller government, as opposed to a more intense position, but and different conversation either for the next webcast or another time in the future. I suspect the Democratic Party is going to change as a result of this one too. Society is going to change as a result of this crisis. It can't help but to. And successful political parties, or at least political parties intent on survival, recognize that when society changes, and when the goals and concerns and priorities of their constituents change, those parties have to adapt and adjust too. So the Republican Party may become more open to a somewhat more expansive role for government, but I think Democrats are going to have to adjust as well.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think this will be our final question. And if you could maybe just talk a little bit about, because we're getting a lot of questions, about the impact regarding China in terms of the campaigns having to respond to that and to their bases and their concerns about China's influence potentially on the election, and then the uprising aggression or xenophobia towards people that are Chinese or Chinese American.
Wow. For those of you who have attended our Cal Eisenberg breakfast in the past, you may remember that in January, we were fortunate enough to be joined by John Emerson, the former US ambassador to Germany, who talked about foreign policy in the presidential campaign. And John, if you're on this call, now would be a really good time to weigh in, because I'd love to have you by my side to answer this question, but I'll do my best. I'll do my best without him. I think the question really breaks down into two different areas. One is a question of geopolitics, the increasingly tense and increasingly confrontational relationship between the United States and China. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because that's a very complicated one. The other is a much simpler and much more straightforward one, and that's racism and xenophobia in our society, which existed before a coronavirus and will exist after one. There's no question that the tensions between, all of you know this, all the tensions between the US and China have been growing on a number of fronts for many years now. Most of the people in both parties who I respect would look back at some regret at a generation-long strategy of strategic engagement with China on the US's part, which was designed to encourage them and prod them toward adopting more democratic norms, did not succeed. And while the current president has taken a much more confrontational tack than others might have counseled, his rejection of that Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama approach to China is reflected more broadly across the political spectrum. And it's very clear that the fact that the current coronavirus did first appear in China has exacerbated and intensified the geopolitical tensions between the countries, and we saw that in the UN Security Council yesterday. The more straightforward but more troubling aspect of the question is, what do you do in a society when people are conditioned to look for other people and other groups to blame for their problems? And this is a challenge we've faced in this country and that many other of the Western democracies have faced to increasing severity in recent years. For many years, we looked to blame people who didn't look like us or talk like us for our problems, and that's still the case all too often today. Increasingly in this country today, the them aren't just people who don't look like us or talk like us, they're people who don't think like us, people who vote for other candidates or support other parties. And so, unfortunately, over the course of many years, we as a society have been much more willing to tolerate these levels of xenophobia, of intolerance, and of real hatred from the ideological extremes on both sides. Those loud, angry voices from the right and from the far left as well. And so it's not surprising, although somewhat frustrating, that so many people in this time of national crisis and geopolitical complexity look for an easy them to blame. In this case, the fact that this disease happened to start in a country with whom we already had a serious rivalry. My hope is, and with any luck, this can be a conversation for a future webinar. History shows us that these type of crises, once they pass, generally tend to have a unifying effect on society. And if in the years leading up to the coronavirus, we've become a more divided and a more polarized and a more hyper-partisan society, history shows that the nation's most significant, most challenging crises, World War II, the Civil War, you can name others, generally did tend to allow us, at least temporarily, to put aside those differences and move forward together more collectively. My hope for American politics going forward is that we remember that fighting the common foe of the coronavirus is something that will bring us together much more than the differences we face because we happen to have a different opinion on how the research and development tax credit ought to be implemented, whether or not fracking should be allowed, and even who is our preferred candidate for elective office. All sorts of horrible things have come out and will continue to come out of the challenge we currently face. But if it does remind us, the risk of sounding a little bit naive, if it can remind us that the things that unite us are in fact greater than the things that divide us, then let's make that a small silver lining as we work to get through these challenges. With that, we're a few minutes away from finishing. And so Jessica, I'll thank you for helping me through this. I'll thank all of you for joining us today. I'm told this is a very large turnout, and I take that as a great compliment, and I hope you'll come back again next week for my conversation with John Thomas and our programs in the future.